Hi, I'm Garth Drinkwater from Small Business CGT Concessions Specialists. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Small Business Retirement Exemption. Particularly, I'm going to talk to you about the requirements that must be satisfied for the exemption to be available and what the exemption is. I'll start with the requirements that must be satisfied for the exemption to be available. Now, some of the requirements use the terms small business participation percentage, significant individual, and CGT concession stakeholder. I'll briefly touch on these. The term small business participation percentage is covered in a separate video, but for now, let's just assume that it is the sum of all the direct and indirect ownership interests. A significant individual is an individual that has a small business participation percentage in a company or trust of at least 20%. A CGT concession stakeholder is an individual that has a small business participation percentage in a company or trust of at least 20%, or the spouse of such an individual, where the spouse has a small business participation percentage of greater than 0. So back to the requirements. They are: Requirement 1. The basic conditions for the small business CGT concessions must be satisfied. They relate to things like the CGT Small Business Entity Test, the Maximum Net Asset Value Test, the Active Asset Test, and the 4 additional tests for shares in a company or units in a unit trust. If you would like information about the basic conditions, they're covered in separate videos. An exception to this requirement is where the capital gain is a result of CGT event J5 or J6. If you would like information about CGT event J5 or J6, they are covered in the separate video about the small business rollover. Requirement 2. If the taxpayer is a company or trust, then the company or trust must satisfy the significant individual test, which requires that the company or trust have at least one significant individual just before the CGT event. Requirement 3. The choice to apply the small business retirement exemption must be made in writing, must specify the CGT exempt amount, and must be made by the day the taxpayer lodges their income tax return for the relevant year in which the capital gain arose, or a longer period if allowed by the Commissioner. This is one of those times where the way the income tax return is prepared is not sufficient evidence of the making of the choice. Requirement 4. If the taxpayer is a company or trust that has more than one CGT concession stakeholder, then the choice must also specify the percentage of each asset's CGT exempt amount that is attributable to each of those individuals. Requirement 5. If the taxpayer is a company or trust, then the company or trust must make a payment directly or indirectly to its CGT concession stakeholders. The amount of the payment must equal the lesser of the capital proceeds received or the CGT exempt amount. However, if the capital gain arose from CGT event J2, J5 or J6, then the amount of the payment must equal the lesser of the amount of the capital gain or the CGT exempt amount. Requirement 6. If the taxpayer is a company or trust, then the amount paid to each CGT concession stakeholder must be worked out by reference to each individual's percentage of the CGT exempt amount. Requirement 7. If the taxpayer is a company or trust, then the payment must be made by the later of 7 days after the company or trust makes the choice and 7 days after the company or trust receives an amount of the capital proceeds. However, if the capital gain arose from CGT event J2, J5 or J6, then the payment must be made 7 days after the company or trust makes the choice. Requirement 8. If the taxpayer is an individual that is under 55 years of age just before the choice to apply the small business retirement exemption is made, then the individual must contribute an amount equal to the CGT exempt amount to a complying superannuation fund. Requirement 9. If the taxpayer is a company or trust and the relevant CGT concession stakeholder is under 55 years of age just before the relevant payment is made, then the payment must be made to a complying superannuation fund on their behalf rather to them directly or indirectly. And the company or trust must notify the superannuation fund that the payment is made in respect of the small business retirement exemption. I've just talked about the requirements that must be satisfied for the exemption to be available. I'll now talk about what the exemption is. The small business retirement exemption applies after applying capital losses and any discount for discount capital gains. If both the small business retirement exemption and the small business rollover could apply, the taxpayer can choose which order to apply them. If you would like information about the small business rollover, it's covered in a separate video. Also, the small business retirement exemption does not apply, but the small business 15-year exemption applies. Similarly, If you would like information about the Small Business 15-year exemption, it's covered in a separate video. Where the Small Business Retirement Exemption applies, it disregards all or part of the capital gain. The amount that is disregarded is called the CGT exempt amount, and the CGT exempt amount cannot exceed the relevant individual's CGT retirement exemption limit, which is $500,000, reduced by any amounts previously disregarded by the Small Business Retirement Exemption. If the taxpayer is a company or trust that is required to make a payment to a complying superannuation fund, then the contribution should be treated as though it was a contribution made by the CGT concession stakeholder. And that's it. That's the Small Business Retirement Exemption. If you'd like to know more or get in contact, head on over to our website.